There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. You can feel it at a crowded table, surrounded by people who love you. You can feel it in the middle of a good conversation, in a room that is warm and full and kind. A quiet certainty settles over you, almost like a change in temperature, that not one of these people can quite reach you. That if you tried to say the thing you actually mean, the real thing, the thing underneath the small talk, it would land in the space between you and simply fall, and so you don't say it. You smile, you nod, you pass the bread, and you carry the feeling home with you, where it has always been waiting. Most advice about this feeling tells you to fix it. Open up. Be vulnerable. Put yourself out there. Find your people. And almost none of it works, because almost none of it understands what the feeling actually is. It treats the loneliness as a problem of quantity, as if you simply have not yet met enough people, when the ache you are describing is not about quantity at all. Two of the most uncomfortable thinkers who ever lived spent their lives circling this exact feeling. Arthur Schopenhauer, who was perhaps the loneliest philosopher in history, and Carl Jung, who built an entire psychology around the fear of facing oneself, and between them they arrive at something you have almost certainly never been told, that this feeling, the loneliness that follows you into crowded rooms, is not a flaw in you. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It may, in fact, be the most intelligent thing about you. It may be the exact sensation of a person who has quietly outgrown the kind of connection they are being offered and does not yet have the language to say so. For the next hour, I want to take that feeling apart with you, slowly and carefully, the way you would take apart a knot you have been pulling at for years, not to make it disappear, but to show you what it has been trying to tell you the whole time. So stay with me. Let the noise settle, and let's begin where the feeling begins, which is not with other people at all. It begins with the strange discovery that you can be surrounded and still be alone. Let's start by separating two words that the language has quietly glued together: loneliness and solitude. We treat them as the same thing wearing different clothes. We assume that to be alone is to be lonely, and to be lonely is to be alone, and that the cure for both is simply more people. But Jung drew a line between them that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. Loneliness, he said, does not come from having no people around you. It comes from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to yourself. Read that again, slowly, because everything in this hour rests on it. The loneliness is not the empty room. The loneliness is the full room in which the thing that matters most to you has no way out. It is the words that die on the way to your mouth, because you already know from long experience that they will not survive the journey to another person, that they will be misheard or softened, or answered with a joke, or met with a kind and total blankness. And this is why the crowded room can be so much worse than the empty one. In the empty room, the silence is honest. There is no one there to fail to understand you, and so there is nothing to grieve. But in the crowded room, you are surrounded by the constant possibility of being reached, and the constant experience of not being reached, over and over, minute after minute. Every laugh you don't quite share, every conversation that skates across the surface of something you feel in your depths is a small confirmation that the distance is real. The crowd does not dissolve the loneliness. The crowd measures it. So the first thing I want you to consider is that you may have been misdiagnosing yourself for years. You have been treating a problem of depth as if it were a problem of quantity. You have been adding people to a life that was not asking for more people, it was asking for more contact, and those are not the same request. 100 acquaintances will not add up to the one conversation you are actually starving for. In fact, they will often make the hunger louder, because each of them reminds you gently of what is missing. Now hold that thought, because Schopenhauer is about to give us a picture for it. A strange, bristling little picture that he scribbled into the margins of his last great work, and that has haunted psychology ever since. He called it the parable of the porcupines, and most people who repeat it get it exactly backwards. Here is the parable as he wrote it. On a cold winter's day, a group of porcupines huddle together to keep from freezing, but as they press close, they begin to prick one another with their quills, and the pain drives them apart. The cold drives them back together, the quills drive them apart again, and they oscillate like this, back and forth, between two kinds of suffering, until at last they discover a middle distance, close enough to share a little warmth, far enough not to wound each other. That moderate distance, Schopenhauer says, is what we call politeness and good manners, and the person who violates it, who presses too close, is told in the English idiom to keep their distance. Now, most people hear this parable as a sad little story about how we can never truly be close, how every relationship is a compromise between coldness and pain, and that reading is there, it is real. But it is not the part Schopenhauer cared about most, and it is not the part that will help you tonight. Look at the last move of the parable, the part almost everyone forgets. Schopenhauer adds that the man who has a great deal of internal warmth of his own will prefer to keep away from the huddle altogether, in order neither to give nor to receive that pain. Read that carefully, because it changes everything. The porcupine who keeps his distance is not the coldest one. He is the warmest. He is the one who carries enough heat inside himself that he does not need to crowd against the others to survive the winter. His distance is not a wound, it is a surplus. He stands apart not because he has less, but because he has enough. And this is the reframe that Schopenhauer hands us more than a century and a half early. The distance you feel from other people may not be a symptom of your emptiness. It may be a symptom of your fullness. It may be that you have quietly developed enough of an inner life, enough internal warmth, that the frantic huddling most people do, the constant seeking of company for its own sake, no longer keeps you warm, because you were not actually cold. Sit with how strange that is. We are taught from the very beginning that the person who needs people constantly is the healthy one, the well-adjusted one, and the person who is content alone is the one we should worry about. Schopenhauer flips the whole arrangement over. The one who cannot bear to be alone, he suggests, is the one running the deepest deficit, because he has nothing inside to fall back on, and so he must press against other bodies just to feel real. And the one who can stand a little apart and not freeze is carrying a fire the others may not have. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where a lesser version of this idea curdles into something arrogant and false. Schopenhauer is not saying that you are better than other people, or that needing others is weakness, or that the goal is to become a cold, self-sufficient island who requires no one. That is the Internet's cartoon of this idea, and it is poison. Human beings are social animals. And real isolation, the clinical kind, the kind that has no warmth in it at all, is genuinely dangerous. And if that is where you are, this reframe is not for that. And I will come back to that distinction before we finish. What Schopenhauer is describing is subtler and truer. He is describing the difference between huddling because you are freezing and choosing your distance because you are warm. Both look like standing a little apart from the crowd. From the outside, they are identical, but from the inside, they are opposites. One is driven by fear, the other is permitted by fullness. And the terrible confusion of modern life is that we have taught an entire generation of the second kind of person, the warm ones, the ones who could stand their own company, to believe they are the first kind, the freezing ones, and to pathologize their own peace as a problem to be medicated with more noise, more contacts, more company they do not actually want. So let me ask you the question underneath all of this, and let it land honestly. When you feel that distance from the people in the room, is it cold or is it warm? Is it the panic of the porcupine who is freezing and cannot get close enough, or is it the quiet of the porcupine who has enough heat of his own and simply does not need to press in? Because those two feelings can be told apart once you know to look. The cold distance is anxious, it reaches, it grasps, it is desperate for the huddle and furious that it cannot join. The warm distance is calm. It notices the others, it wishes them well, and it feels no particular urgency to dissolve into them. It can love people without needing to disappear into them. And if your distance is the warm kind, then a great deal of the advice you have been given your whole life has been quietly insulting you. It has been telling you to fix a fire. Now, Schopenhauer, being Schopenhauer, he does not stop at the comforting half of the idea. He pushes it into a place that is harder to hear, and I think we have to go there, because it is where the real explanation lives. Why exactly does closeness prick? Why is the warmth of other people bundled together with pain, so that you cannot seem to get one without the other? He has an answer, and it runs all the way down to his picture of what a human being fundamentally is. Schopenhauer believed that beneath all our reasons and manners and conversations, a human being is essentially a bundle of restless wanting. He called it the will, a blind, ceaseless striving that is never satisfied for long, that gets what it wants and immediately wants the next thing, that is, in his bleak and famous phrase, a pendulum forever swinging between pain and boredom. When we lack something, we suffer the pain of lacking it. And on the rare occasions when we have everything we thought we wanted, the wanting does not stop, it simply runs out of targets, and we suffer the second enemy, boredom, that flat, grey emptiness that sends us looking for the next thing to want. And here is why this matters for loneliness. Society, Schopenhauer says, is mostly our remedy for the second enemy. We seek company not primarily out of love, but out of an inability to bear our own emptiness. Most socializing, in his hard view, is two bored people using each other to avoid the boredom, pressing together not for warmth, but simply to not be alone with the pendulum. And this is why the pricks come with the warmth. When you huddle against people out of your own inner emptiness, you bring the emptiness with you. You are not meeting them. You are using them, and they are using you, to escape a hollowness that neither of you will name, and something in both of you can feel the transaction, and it hurts. Which means the loneliness in the crowded room may be the most honest thing happening in it. It may be the one part of you that refuses to pretend that the huddle is intimacy, that notices underneath the laughter that no one is actually meeting anyone, that everyone is using the gathering to not be alone, and that this is not the same as being together. Your loneliness in that reading is not your failure to connect. It is your refusal to call the counterfeit real. It is the part of you that still remembers what genuine contact would feel like and will not accept the substitute, no matter how many times it is offered. That is a heavy thing to carry, but it is not nothing. It means the ache is not emptiness. The ache is a standard. You are lonely, in part because some part of you knows the difference between contact and its imitation and will not let you forget it. So we have our first layer. Loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the inability to communicate what matters. The distance you feel may be warm, not cold, a surplus and not a deficit. And the pricks of closeness come because most closeness is not closeness at all. It is two forms of emptiness pressed together and calling it warmth. But Schopenhauer, for all his brilliance, leaves us standing in a cold place. He can explain why the crowd fails you. He cannot tell you what to do with the fire you are carrying, or where the deeper contact you are actually hungry for might be found. For that, we have to turn to a very different man, one who took Schopenhauer's darkness seriously and then walked straight through it into the one room Schopenhauer never fully entered, the room where you are, finally, completely alone with yourself. Carl Jung spent his life in that room, and what he found there is the other half of this story. Jung began where Schopenhauer ended, but he refused to stay there. He agreed that the crowd is mostly noise, that most togetherness is a kind of mutual hiding. But where Schopenhauer saw only a cold universe of colliding wants, Jung saw something else in the solitary place. He saw a workshop. He saw the one location in a human life where a person can actually become someone. And to understand why, we have to look at what Jung thought was really happening when people feel connected, because it is not at all what we assume. Jung borrowed a phrase from the anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl to describe the most common form of human bonding. He called it participation mystique, a mystical participation. It sounds beautiful, and it is not. What it names is a state in which you cannot tell where you end and the other person begins. A merging so complete that your moods, your opinions, your sense of self bleed into the group and become indistinguishable from it. It is what happens in a crowd that roars as one. It is what happens in a family that shares a single unspoken rule that no one is allowed to question. It is what happens in the group of friends where everyone somehow believes the same things, wants the same things, mocks the same things, and no one remembers deciding any of it. We call this connection. Jung called it something closer to unconsciousness, because in participation mystique, the bond is real, but it is bought at a price, and the price is your individual awareness. To merge that completely with a group, you have to switch off the part of you that stands apart and sees for itself. You have to dissolve. And most people, most of the time, are more than willing to pay, because the dissolving feels wonderful. It is warm, it is effortless. It is the relief of not having to be a separate, responsible, conscious self for a while. It is the huddle. Now hold this up against the feeling we started with, the loneliness in the crowded room, and watch what happens. Because if connection, for most people, is this unconscious merging, this dissolving into the group, then what does it mean when you find that you can no longer dissolve? When you sit in the warm crowd and some stubborn point of awareness in you refuses to melt, refuses to switch off, keeps standing a little apart and watching even as you laugh along, it means you have begun to individuate. It means a self has started to form in you that is too distinct, too awake to disappear back into the group mind. And the loneliness you feel is the friction of that self, scraping against a kind of belonging that requires you to not exist. This is the reframe that turns the whole thing over. You are not failing to connect, you are failing to dissolve. And those are not the same failure. The first is a wound, the second is a birth. What feels like being locked out of the warmth may actually be the early painful evidence that you have become someone specific enough that you can no longer be melted down into everyone. The group can only hold you on the condition that you stop being fully yourself, and some part of you has quietly decided it will no longer pay that price. That part does not yet have a home. And its homelessness is what you feel as loneliness. I want to slow down here, because this is delicate. I am not telling you that you are too special for other people. That is the arrogant cartoon again, and it is a trap, and it will make you insufferable and eventually genuinely alone in the bad way. The point is not that you are above the crowd. The point is that a certain kind of belonging, the total, dissolving, unconscious kind, stops being available to a person as they become more themselves, and the loss of it hurts even when it is a sign of growth. You can grieve the huddle and still not be able to return to it. Both things are true. The warmth was real, and you have outgrown the price of it. So what replaces it? If you can no longer dissolve into the group, are you simply condemned to stand outside the window in the cold, watching other people be warm? This is exactly the question that would have trapped Schopenhauer, and it is exactly where Jung opens a door that Schopenhauer never walked through. Jung's answer begins with a strange observation about the people we instinctively respect. Think for a moment about the person in your life who carries a quiet authority, not the loudest person in the room, not the one performing hardest for attention, the other one, the one who speaks rarely, and when they do, the room leans in, the one whose stillness makes you slightly self-conscious, as if they can see more than they say. There is almost always such a person, and we are drawn to them, and we do not quite know why. Jung had a name for what they carry. He called it mana, an old word for a kind of concentrated, almost magical energy. And his explanation for where it comes from is the key to everything we are building toward tonight. That quiet authority, he said, belongs to the person who has done the solitary work, the person who has spent real time alone with themselves, who has faced the parts of their own mind that most people spend their whole lives fleeing, and who has, through that confrontation, gathered up the energy that other people leak constantly into the crowd. Most of us pour our psychic energy outward all day long, into performing, into seeking approval, into managing what others think of us, into the endless work of the huddle. The mana personality has stopped leaking. They have turned that energy inward and contained it, and it collects in them like water behind a dam, and other people feel the pressure of it without being able to name it. This is why the quietest person is so often the most respected, not because they are hiding some secret cleverness, but because they are not spending themselves. Their silence is not empty. It is full. It is contained energy, and the containment is itself a kind of power. And every person in the room can feel it, even if no one could explain it. And here is the part that should stop you cold. That containment is only possible through solitude. The mana is what you gather in the exact place you have been taught to fear. The quiet authority that draws people to certain human beings is built, without exception, in the room alone. Do you see what Jung has done? He has taken the very thing Schopenhauer left as a cold consolation prize, the capacity to be alone, and revealed it as the workshop where a self is forged and where a strange gravity is grown, the gravity that actually draws people toward you rather than the desperation that pushes them away. The person frantically huddling for warmth repels, subtly, constantly, because neediness repels. The person who has gathered their fire in solitude attracts, because contained energy attracts. The great irony, which Jung states almost casually, and which should be carved somewhere you can see it, is that the surest way to stop being lonely in the deepest sense is to become someone who can be profoundly alone. The people who are never abandoned are, very often, precisely the people who learned they could survive the solitude, and who therefore never again clutch at others out of fear. But to get there, to become that contained, magnetic, individuated self, you have to do the one thing the crowd exists to help you avoid. You have to go into the room alone and meet the person who is waiting there. And that person, Jung warned, is not who you think. That is where this turns from a comfort into a genuine challenge, and it is where we go next. Because the reason solitude is so powerful is the same reason it is so frightening. When the noise finally stops, you are left alone with the one human being you have been running from your entire life, yourself. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing a person can do is to accept themselves completely, not improve themselves, not perform a better version of themselves, accept themselves completely, including all the parts they have spent a lifetime pretending are not there. And he believed this was the real reason human beings are so frightened of being alone. Not because solitude is boring, because solitude removes the audience. Think about who you are in a crowd. You are to some degree a performance, not a lie exactly, but a curated version. The self you have learned is acceptable, the one that gets approval and avoids rejection. Jung called this the persona, the mask, and it is not a bad thing, we all need one. But the persona only works when there is someone to wear it for. Other people are the mirror that keeps it in place. As long as you are surrounded, you can see yourself reflected back as the person you are pretending to be, and the pretending feels like truth. Take the mirror away, and something begins to happen. Alone, with no one to perform for, the persona has no audience, and slowly it starts to slip. And what surfaces underneath it is everything you have been keeping off stage. The envy you would never admit to, the grief you have been too busy to feel, the anger, the fear, the parts of yourself you decided long ago were unacceptable and exiled from the lit rooms of your personality. Jung called this exiled material the shadow, and solitude is the place where the shadow comes to find you. This is the real reason so many people cannot sit in a silent room for 10 minutes without reaching for their phone. It is not that they are addicted to the device, it is that the silence is a door. And behind the door is the self they have been avoiding, and the phone is a way of holding the door shut. Every notification is a small errand that saves you from the meeting. We are not afraid of being alone. We are afraid of who is waiting for us there. And now, finally, we can say something true and difficult about the loneliness in the crowded room. Sometimes that loneliness is not only about the failure of the people around you to reach you, sometimes it is your own psyche insisting on a meeting you keep postponing. The ache you feel, among others, may be the pressure of a self that has been trying to get your attention for years, and that cannot be heard over the noise, and that uses the loneliness like a hand on your shoulder, turning you, gently and persistently, back toward the room you refuse to enter. The room where you would finally be alone with yourself. The feeling is not only saying, these people cannot reach me, it is also saying, you cannot reach me either, not while you keep running. Jung had a name for the descent that happens when a person finally stops running and goes into that room. He borrowed the image of the night sea journey, the old myth of the hero swallowed by the dark, carried under the water, dissolved in the belly of the whale, and then changed, returned. He believed that every real transformation in a human life follows this shape. You go down into the dark alone. You meet what is waiting, and you come back carrying something you could not have found any other way. Not because solitude is pleasant, because solitude is the only water deep enough for the journey. You cannot be transformed in the huddle. The huddle exists precisely to keep you the same, to keep everyone the same, warm and unchanged and safe. Transformation happens in the one place the crowd cannot follow you. And here is what waits on the far side of that journey, the thing Schopenhauer glimpsed but could not quite reach. When you have gone into the solitude and met yourself and survived it, being alone stops being a punishment. It becomes company. Schopenhauer said that a man of rich inner life will, in solitude, find his own society, and this is not a metaphor. When you have made peace with the person in the quiet room, you are no longer alone with a stranger. You are alone with someone you know, and increasingly someone you can bear, and eventually someone whose company you actually prefer to the counterfeit warmth of the huddle. The loneliness does not vanish because you finally found enough people. It dissolves because you finally stopped being lonely for yourself. But I promised you this would not end in a cold room, and it will not, because there is one more turn, and it is the most important one. Because the goal of all this solitude is not to end up alone. That would be a tragedy, and it would be a misreading. The goal is to become the kind of person who can finally have the deep connection you were starving for the whole time. And to see how, I want to give you a single sentence from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who understood this better than almost anyone. Rilke wrote that love consists in this, that two solitudes protect and border and greet each other. Sit with that picture, because it is the answer to everything we have been circling. Not two people who dissolve into one another until neither exists, which is participation mystique, the huddle, the merging that costs you yourself, but two solitudes, two whole, distinct, fully formed human beings, each of whom has done the work of becoming someone, each of whom can stand alone, turning toward each other across a respected distance and greeting what they find. That is the deep contact you have been hungry for, not the loss of yourself in another person, the meeting of yourself with theirs, and you cannot offer it until you have a self to bring. The lonely huddle has no one in it, only two absences pressed together. Real intimacy requires two presences, and a presence is exactly what solitude builds. This is why the reframe matters so much and why getting it wrong is so costly. The person who never learns to be alone never becomes a solitude, and so can never be one half of Rilke's love. They can only merge and dissolve and cling and lose themselves in others and call it connection and never understand why it always feels a little empty. But the person who goes through the solitude and comes out the other side with a self intact becomes capable of a kind of closeness the huddle never offers. They can love without disappearing. They can be near you without needing to consume you. They can greet you across the distance instead of collapsing it. And that greeting, two solitudes bordering each other, is worth more than 1,000 nights lost in the crowd. Before we bring this down to the ground, I have to say something about the particular moment you are living in, because Schopenhauer and Jung were describing a permanent feature of the human condition, but you are experiencing it under conditions they could never have imagined, and those conditions have made everything we have discussed both harder and more urgent. Consider the strangest fact about the present age. We are, by every measurable standard, the most connected human beings who have ever lived. You are carrying right now a device that can reach almost any person on Earth in seconds, that holds more conversation and company and community than any king in history could have commanded. And we are, at the same time, by every measurable standard, among the loneliest human beings who have ever lived. The connection went up, and the loneliness went up with it. At the same time, in the same people, any honest theory of loneliness has to explain that paradox. And the one we have built tonight explains it exactly. Because everything we have said points to a single conclusion: loneliness was never a problem of quantity. It was always a problem of depth, of contact, of the meeting of one real self with another. And the device in your pocket is a machine of almost perfect quantity and almost zero depth. It is the huddle, industrialized. It offers you infinite warmth of the shallowest possible kind, an endless scroll of other people, an unbroken stream of company that asks nothing of you and gives nothing back that lasts. You need never be bored again. You need never sit in a silent room and feel the door to yourself begin to open. And you need never ever have the deep, risky, self-exposing conversation that is the only thing that would actually feed you. It solves the wrong problem perfectly. It cures the boredom Schopenhauer named, and in curing it, it quietly starves you of the solitude where a self is built and the depth where a self is met. Think about what the phone actually does to the two rooms we have been describing. It stands in the doorway of both. It stands in the doorway of solitude, so that you can no longer be alone with yourself. Because the moment the silence threatens to speak, your hand moves to the screen and the errand begins. And it stands in the doorway of intimacy, so that you can no longer be fully with another person either, because there is always a third thing on the table, glowing, promising that something more interesting is happening somewhere else. It does not connect the two solitudes Rilke described. It prevents either of them from ever forming. You cannot become a solitude because you are never alone. And you cannot greet one because you are never fully present. The machine feeds you just enough of the counterfeit that you never go looking for the real thing. And it does something worse, something Jung would have recognized instantly. Remember participation mystique, the unconscious merging into the group mind, the dissolving of the individual self into the mood of the crowd. What Jung watched happen in a room, or a rally, or a family, has now been built into a system that operates on hundreds of millions of people at once, all day, every day. The feed is participation mystique at industrial scale. It is engineered to pull you into a single churning group emotion, to make you feel what the crowd feels, want what the crowd wants, fear what the crowd fears, rage when the crowd rages, all without a single conscious decision on your part. It is the largest machine for dissolving the individual self that has ever existed, and it is pointed directly at the part of you that Jung said must be protected and grown in solitude if you are ever to become a whole person. So here is the quiet emergency underneath the ordinary feeling of being lonely in a crowd. In an age like this one, the capacity to be genuinely alone, to sit in silence and meet yourself, to gather your energy back instead of leaking it into the feed all day, is not just a path to a richer life. It is becoming a form of resistance. It is one of the last ways left to remain an individual at all, to keep some part of yourself that has not been merged into the group mind, that still stands a little apart and sees for itself. The person who can be alone, really alone, without reaching for the screen, is doing something almost radical now. They are refusing the largest huddle in human history. They are keeping a self, and this reframes your loneliness one final time. And I think this is the most important turn of all. That feeling of being unable to dissolve, of standing a little apart even inside the warm crowd, of sensing that the connection on offer is not the real thing in this age. That feeling may be the healthiest thing about you. It may be the last uncorrupted instrument you have. It is the part of you that has not been fully absorbed, that still knows the difference between contact and its imitation, that still aches for the real thing precisely because it has not agreed to accept the counterfeit. In a world engineered to dissolve every self into a single scrolling mood, your loneliness is the sound of a self refusing to disappear. It is not your sickness. In an age like this, it may be the sign that you are still awake. Nietzsche, who understood loneliness as well as any human being who ever lived, and who paid for that understanding with a loneliness few could survive, left a single line that belongs here. "The higher we soar," he wrote, "the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." He did not mean it as arrogance. He meant it as a description of a real cost. That the more you individuate, the more you wake up, the more you become genuinely yourself, the stranger and more distant you may look to those still safely merged in the crowd, and the lonelier the climb becomes. This is the risk Jung's path carries, and I will not pretend it away. Becoming a self is not free. There is a real loneliness in it. The loneliness of the one who has climbed a little higher and can no longer pretend not to see. But Nietzsche's point, and Jung's, and even bitter old Schopenhauer's, is that the answer is not to stop climbing and crawl back into the warm huddle where nothing is asked and nothing is seen. The answer is to climb high enough to find the others who are also flying. They are up there. They are rarer and harder to find, and they will not be waiting in the largest and loudest crowds. But two solitudes who have both made the climb can greet each other across the thin, high air in a way that 1,000 people huddled in the valley never will. So let me bring this all the way down to the ground, because ideas that stay in the air are useless, and I want you to be able to carry this into your actual life. First, stop trying to cure a hunger for depth with a diet of quantity. If the loneliness you feel is the warm kind, the kind that comes from a self that can no longer dissolve, then adding more shallow contact will not touch it and may make it worse. You do not need more people. You need deeper contact with fewer. And that begins by admitting that the ache was never about numbers. Second, build the inner life on purpose. The warmth Schopenhauer describes, the internal warmth that lets you keep your distance without freezing, is not a personality trait you either have or do not. It is built deliberately in solitude. Time spent alone that is not filled with a screen. Walking without a podcast. Sitting with a thought until it finishes. Writing down what you actually think for no one but yourself. This is not indulgence. It is the work of gathering your energy back from the crowd so that it can collect in you, so that your distance becomes warm instead of cold. Third, when you do reach for connection, go for the real thing and go first. The deep conversation you are starving for almost never arrives on its own, because everyone in the room is waiting for someone else to stop performing. Be the one who stops. Say the true thing to the one person who might survive it. Risk the sentence that could fall into the space between you, because sometimes it does not fall. Sometimes it lands, and a solitude on the other side of the table looks up and greets you, and in that moment the loneliness of 100 crowded rooms is answered at once. And fourth, the caveat I promised, and it matters, so hear it clearly. Everything I've said tonight is about a particular kind of loneliness, the warm kind. The kind that is really a hunger for depth and a sign of a self coming into form. But there is another kind. There is the cold, total isolation that has no warmth in it at all, the loneliness that comes with despair, that isolates you and tells you no one would notice if you disappeared. That is not the porcupine keeping his warm distance. That is the porcupine freezing. And if that is where you are, please do not use anything I have said as a reason to retreat further. That loneliness is real, and it is not a philosophy problem, and you deserve actual human help and actual human contact, and reaching for it is not weakness. It is the exact strength this whole hour has been about. Knowing the difference between the solitude that builds you and the isolation that erodes you is itself a part of wisdom. One is a fire you are tending. The other is a cold you should not face alone. So, we return, at the end, to where we began. The crowded table, the warm room, the people who love you, and the quiet certainty that not one of them can quite reach you. But you are not the same person sitting there now, because now you know what the feeling is. It is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is a signal as honest as hunger, and it is not telling you to find more people. It is telling you that the contact on offer has fallen beneath the level your inner life now requires. It is telling you that a self has been forming in you that is too awake to dissolve, and that this self is lonely in part for you. And it is pointing patiently toward the one room where the answer has been waiting the whole time, not the crowd, the quiet. So the next time you feel it, in the middle of the noise, do not reach immediately for your phone to shut the door. Let the feeling speak. Ask it what it is actually hungry for. And understand that the loneliest thing you can do is spend your whole life in crowds, avoiding the one person who could finally end the loneliness: yourself. The people who feel most alone are so often not the empty ones. They are the ones who are almost full, who have gathered enough fire to no longer need the huddle, and who have simply never been told that the distance they feel is not a wound, it is a doorway. And on the other side of it is not more isolation. It is the self you are always meant to become, and the deep, unhurried, unafraid connection that only that self can hold. The cold drives the porcupines together, but the warm ones, Schopenhauer said, can keep their distance, not because they feel nothing, because they have finally become someone worth being alone with. Be one of the warm ones. Tend the fire, and let the quiet, for once, be not the thing you fear, but the place you finally come home.